Dust devils danced outside the grimy window panes of what Dr. Elijah stubbornly called his clinic. It was more a shack than anything, really, cobbled together from scavenged wood and desperation in a forgotten corner of the territory. Inside, the air hung thick with the smells of antiseptic, stale whiskey, and fear. Elijah, once a respected physician in a civilized city, now patched up bullet holes and knife wounds for outlaws who paid him in stolen gold and whispered secrets. His hands, once steady and sure, now trembled slightly as he cleaned a rusty scalpel. Shame was a constant companion, a bitter taste on his tongue. He wasn't proud of what he'd become. The circumstances that led to his disgrace were a tangled web he preferred not to revisit. It was enough to know that the life he'd built was gone, replaced by this grim existence. Survival was his primary motivation. The outlaws paid well enough to keep him fed and sheltered, a meager comfort compared to his former life, but comfort nonetheless. He told himself he was providing a service, however dubious. Someone had to keep these men alive, even if it meant prolonging their violent careers. Cynicism was a shield, protecting him from the weight of his choices. He saw himself as a necessary evil, a cog in the machine of the Wild West, no better or worse than the men who bled on his table. The door to the clinic burst open, splintering the already weak frame. Two men, faces hidden behind bandanas, staggered in, half carrying, half dragging a third. He was a large man, even slumped over as he was, and a dark stain bloomed across his shirt. "Doc, we need your help. It's Bart." Elijah recognized the name, even if he'd never met the man. Black Bart, a legend, whispered in hushed tones around campfires. A ruthless killer, yes, but one who supposedly never broke his word. Even outlaws had their rules. Elijah sighed, pushing aside his cynicism for the moment. A life was a life, even Bart's. "Lay him on the table," he directed, his voice sharper than usual. The men heaved Bart onto the makeshift operating table. The outlaw groaned, his face contorted in pain. Elijah quickly assessed the wound. A bullet clean through the gut. Bad, but not immediately fatal. "Give me some water and clean rags," he barked, already preparing his instruments. As he worked, Elijah couldn't help but feel a flicker of something akin to anticipation. Bart was different. He was a name, a force. Dealing with him could be dangerous, but it could also be interesting. A break from the monotonous routine of treating petty thieves and claim jumpers. He would have to be careful. Elijah worked quickly, his skilled hands suturing the wound. Bart, surprisingly, remained conscious, though his breathing was shallow. "Harding," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. Elijah paused, wiping sweat from his brow. "Harding? The railroad man?" Bart nodded weakly. "He set me up, wanted me gone." He coughed, a bloody froth appearing on his lips. "He's a snake, document-taking land. Cheating folks thinks he's above the law. Most men with that kind of money do," Elijah muttered, more to himself than Bart. "I got proof." Bart strained, his grip tightening on Elijah's arm. "Documents show everything. Where he hides his money, the deals he makes. Enough to bring him down." He looked directly into Elijah's eyes, his gaze intense despite his pain. "They're hidden in my saddlebags, under the lining." Elijah hesitated. This was bigger than anything he'd dealt with before. He was used to treating the symptoms of lawlessness, not confronting the disease itself. "Why are you telling me this?" "Don't trust anyone else," Bart gasped. "They'll sell it to him or run. You're different. You got a look about you. Like you've seen bad things, too." He closed his eyes, his breathing becoming more labored. "Get them to the right people, Doc, make him pay." Bart's grip loosened, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the shack's roof. His chest rose and fell one last time, then stilled. Black Bart was dead. Elijah stared at the body, the weight of Bart's last words pressing down on him. He glanced at the saddlebags lying in the corner, innocently unassuming. Inside, according to Bart, lay the key to Harding's downfall and perhaps Elijah's own salvation or destruction. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the familiar ache of indecision settling in. Expose Harding? The thought was terrifying. It would mean risking everything, his life, his meager existence. Harding was a powerful man, with resources that Elijah couldn't even imagine. He'd be hunted, surely killed. But the alternative, selling the documents. He could disappear, start a new life, far away from the dust and the blood and the shame. He could finally have the comfort he craved, the security he'd lost. A comfortable, some would buy him a new identity, a quiet life, maybe even a chance to practice medicine again, legitimately. Elijah paced the small room, the silence broken only by the creaking of the floorboards. Goal versus what? Justice? Redemption? He hadn't thought about such things in years. He was a survivor, not a saint. But Bart's plea echoed in his mind. Make him pay. The choice was his, and the stakes were higher than ever before. The quiet Elijah had known was shattered a few days later. A new kind of tension filled the air, thicker than the usual unease of harboring criminals. Whispers replaced boasts in the clinic waiting area. Men shifted nervously, eyes darting towards the horizon. One of them, a wiry outlaw named Needles, approached Elijah. "Doc," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Heard some fellas asking about Bart. Mean-looking bunch. Say they're working for Harding." Elijah felt a cold dread creep into his bones. Harding knew. It was only a matter of time. He had to decide, and quickly. Later that day, a group of rough-looking men rode into the small settlement. They weren't locals. Their clothes were expensive, their weapons well-maintained, and their eyes held a chilling lack of empathy. They moved with a confidence that spoke of power and impunity. The leader, a man with a scarred face and a silver tooth, dismounted in front of the clinic. "Anyone seen a man named Bart?" he asked, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "Or maybe some documents he was carrying? Mr. Harding would be very grateful for their return." He smiled, a cruel, humorless expression, and less grateful for anyone who's been helping him. Elijah watched from the window, his heart pounding in his chest. The pressure was on. The outlaws who frequented his clinic were now caught in the crossfire, their lives threatened by Harding's ruthless pursuit. Elijah's decision no longer only affected him. The bounty hunters began their search. They ransacked the saloon, terrorized the shopkeeper, and questioned anyone who dared to cross their path. Elijah tried to remain detached, to see himself as an observer, not a participant. But detachment became impossible when they turned their attention to old Mrs. Peabody, the baker. She was a kind, frail woman who sold him day-old bread at a discount. She knew nothing of Bart or Harding or the documents, but she refused to tell the bounty hunters anything, feigning deafness and confusion. In response, they shoved her to the ground, scattering her meager wares in the dirt. Elijah watched from his window, his hands clenching into fists. He knew he should intervene, but fear held him back. Then, one of the bounty hunters kicked Mrs. Peabody's basket, sending it rolling towards Elijah's clinic. A small, hand-knitted doll, meant for her granddaughter, tumbled out. Something snapped inside Elijah. He couldn't stand by any longer. He strode out of the clinic, his face set in a grim line. "Leave her alone," he said, his voice surprisingly steady. The bounty hunter with the silver tooth turned, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Well, well," he said. "Looks like we found someone with a conscience." In that moment, Elijah knew he could no longer pretend to be indifferent. The consequences of his inaction were staring him in the face, a frail old woman lying in the dirt. His detached existence was crumbling around him. Elijah managed to defuse the situation with the bounty hunters, for now. He patched up Mrs. Peabody, his hands gentler than they'd been in years. But the encounter left him shaken. He knew he couldn't keep the documents in the saddlebags. They were too obvious. That night, under the cover of darkness, he carefully removed the document from their hiding place and found a new one, beneath the floorboards of his examination room, the one place he figured no one would dare to look too closely. But paranoia set in. Every cough, every whispered conversation seemed like a threat. He eyed Needles, the wiry outlaw who had warned him about Harding's men. Could he be trusted? What about the other outlaws who came to the clinic? Could any of them be informants? The thought of fleeing crossed his mind. He could take the documents and disappear, find a place where Harding's reach couldn't touch him. But he knew it was a fool's hope. Harding's influence stretched far and wide, like the railroad tracks he so ruthlessly expanded. There was nowhere to run. He was trapped. He had to decide, and soon, whether to fight or surrender. The weight of the secret pressed down on him, heavier than ever. Trust became a luxury he could no longer afford. The arrival of Sarah was like a ray of sunlight, piercing the perpetual gloom of Elijah's clinic. She was young, maybe 20, with honest eyes and a worn but clean dress. She stood in stark contrast to the hardened faces that usually frequented his waiting room. "Doctor," she said, her voice soft but firm, "I need your help. My mother is very sick, and I have nowhere else to turn." Elijah hesitated. He wasn't used to treating honest folk. He'd almost forgotten how. "I usually only see," he began, gesturing vaguely. "I know who you treat," Sarah interrupted, "but I've heard you're a good doctor, regardless. My mother is all I have." He relented, ushering her into the examination room. Her mother was indeed very ill, suffering from a severe lung infection. As Elijah examined her, he couldn't help but notice Sarah's unwavering devotion, her quiet strength. She reminded him of a life he once knew, a life of purpose and integrity. Treating Sarah's mother was a stark reminder of the doctor he used to be. It stirred something within him, a longing for a life beyond the shadows and the moral compromises. Seeing her hope and desperation, her inherent goodness, made his own choices feel even more tainted. The documents, Harding, and the Outlaws seemed a world away from Sarah's simple plea for help. Her presence amplified his moral conflict, forcing him to confront the chasm between the man he was and the man he could be. The relative peace Sarah brought was short-lived. One evening, as Elijah tended to her mother, the unmistakable sound of approaching horses shattered the silence. This time, there were more of them, and their approach was more aggressive. Needles burst into the clinic, his face pale. "Doc, they're back, and they ain't playing nice this time. They're surrounding the place." Elijah looked at Sarah, her face etched with fear. He thought of her mother, weak and vulnerable in the other room. He thought of Mrs. Peabody and the other innocent people caught in the crossfire. His hand instinctively went to the floorboards beneath his feet. The bounty hunter with the silver tooth shouted from outside, "Elijah, we know you have them. Hand over the documents, and no one gets hurt. Otherwise," he let the threat hang in the air, punctuated by the cocking of rifles. Elijah was cornered. He could hand over the documents, saving himself and the others from certain violence. He could disappear into the shadows again, leaving everyone else to fend for themselves. It was the logical, self-preservation-driven choice he would have made just days ago. But looking at Sarah, at the hope in her eyes, at the innocent lives depending on him, something shifted. He couldn't do it. He couldn't betray Bart's trust or condemn these people to Harding's mercy. He had to fight. The question was how? He was just a doctor, not a gunslinger. But maybe, just maybe, he could use his knowledge, his wits, and the element of surprise to even the odds. "We're not giving you anything," Elijah shouted back, his voice surprisingly firm. "Get off our land." He turned to Needles, his eyes gleaming with a newfound resolve. "Help me," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We're going to make them regret coming here." The transformation was remarkable. The cynical, detached doctor was gone, replaced by a man with a purpose. He assessed the clinic with a critical eye, his medical knowledge suddenly taking on a different dimension. The bottles of alcohol, the scalpels, the bandages, they were no longer just tools for healing, but potential weapons. He instructed Needles to barricade the windows and doors. Then he began to set his traps. A tripwire connected to a shelf of heavy medicine bottles. A scalpel strategically placed to catch an unsuspecting foot, a mixture of strong chemicals brewing in a pot, ready to create a blinding cloud. He used his knowledge of anatomy to identify vulnerable points, planning to incapacitate rather than kill. He was a doctor, after all, not a murderer. Even Sarah, seeing the determination in his eyes, offered to help. She gathered rocks and broken glass, ready to defend her mother. As they worked, Elijah felt a spark of his former self ignite. The doctor who had dedicated his life to helping others, the man he thought was lost forever, was still there, buried beneath layers of cynicism and shame. He was fighting for something more than just survival. He was fighting for justice, for redemption, and for the chance to reclaim his soul. The standoff began with a tense silence, broken only by the wind whistling through the cracks in the clinic walls. Then, the bounty hunters opened fire. Bullets ripped through the barricaded windows, sending splinters flying. Elijah and Needles returned fire, using the few guns they had scavenged over time. Elijah focused on accuracy, aiming for limbs and non-lethal areas. He was a doctor, not a killer, and he refused to cross that line. The traps worked surprisingly well. One bounty hunter stumbled over the tripwire, sending a cascade of medicine bottles crashing down on him. Another stepped on the hidden scalpel, letting out a yelp of pain. The chemical mixture created a blinding cloud, disorienting the attackers. The outlaws who had been seeking treatment at the clinic, initially hesitant, reluctantly joined the fight. They knew that if the bounty hunters succeeded, they would be next. Their loyalty was to survival, not to Elijah, but for now, their interests aligned. Sarah, armed with rocks and broken glass, defended the back of the clinic, protecting her mother. Her aim was surprisingly accurate, and she managed to drive back several attackers. The battle raged for what felt like hours. The clinic was a chaotic mess of broken glass, shattered wood, and the acrid smell of gunpowder. Elijah moved with a speed and determination he never knew he possessed, patching up wounds, directing the defense, and firing his gun when necessary. The former doctor was now a leader, a protector, a warrior. The outcome was far from certain, but one thing was clear: they wouldn't go down without a fight. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the remaining bounty hunters retreated, leaving behind a scene of devastation. The clinic was in ruins, the walls riddled with bullet holes, the floor covered in debris. Elijah surveyed the damage, his heart heavy. They had won, but at a cost. Several of the outlaws were wounded, and one, a young man named Billy, lay motionless near the entrance. Sarah's mother, though unharmed, was terrified, and her condition had worsened. The victory felt hollow. Elijah realized that his attempt to remain hidden, to exist on the fringes of society, had failed. Harding knew about him, and he would keep coming. Staying here was no longer an option. He had put these people in danger, and he had to do something to make it right. He looked at Sarah, her face streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes still filled with a quiet strength. "It's over," he said, his voice hoarse. "I can't stay here anymore. It's too dangerous." He knew what he had to do. He had to take the documents to the authorities, expose Harding, and face the consequences. It was a long shot, but it was the only way to protect Sarah, her mother, and everyone else from Harding's wrath. His days of hiding were over. He would embrace his past and fight for a future, even if it meant risking everything. The decision was agonizing, but ultimately, Elijah knew it was the only path he could take. He retrieved the documents from beneath the floorboards, his hands trembling slightly. They felt heavier now, imbued with the weight of responsibility and the promise of potential redemption. He explained his plan to Sarah. He would take her and her mother to the nearest town with a lawman he could trust, a town beyond Harding's immediate influence. He would hand over the documents and hope for the best. "It's dangerous, Sarah," he said, his voice grave. "Harding will stop at nothing to get those documents back. I can't guarantee your safety." "I know the risks, Doctor," she replied, her voice unwavering. "But I trust you, and I believe in what you're doing." He also spoke to Needles and the other outlaws, explaining his decision. Some were skeptical, others openly hostile. They saw him as a fool, throwing away a chance at wealth and security. But a few, surprisingly, offered their support, acknowledging that Harding needed to be stopped. Elijah knew that delivering the documents to the authorities was a gamble. He was a disgraced man, and Harding was a powerful one. But it was a gamble he was willing to take. It was a chance to atone for his past mistakes, to reclaim his honor, and to finally be the man he once was. The road ahead would be perilous, But for the first time in a long time, Elijah felt a flicker of hope. A hope for redemption. As dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Elijah and Sarah, along with her mother, left the ruins of the clinic. They rode on horseback, their faces set with determination. The clinic, once a symbol of his shame and isolation, was now a reminder of his newfound purpose. They left behind Needles and the other outlaws, who promised to help those who had been injured in the fight. They were outlaws, yes, but they had a code, and they respected Elijah's decision. The journey ahead was fraught with peril. They knew that Harding's men would be searching for them, and they had no idea what awaited them in the town they were heading to. But Elijah was no longer the cynical, detached doctor he once was. He was a man with a mission, a man seeking redemption. Sarah, who now placed her trust completely in him, rode beside him, her presence a constant source of strength. He could see the hope in her eyes, a hope that mirrored his own. As they rode towards the horizon, towards an uncertain future, Elijah knew that his journey had just begun. He had a long way to go to atone for his past, but he was finally on the right path. Whether he would succeed in exposing Harding and toppling his corrupt empire remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. He would fight for what was right until his very last breath. The road stretched before them, long and winding, leading to a new, uncertain destiny.